Detective Miles Miller wasn't your typical big city cop. He wasn't gruff, didn't have a drinking problem, at least not a serious one, he joked, and he actually liked paperwork. But what truly set Miller apart was his uncanny ability to notice the things other people missed, the almost invisible scratch on a doorframe, the subtle tremor in a suspect's voice, the way a picture hung slightly askew on a wall. These seemingly insignificant details often unlocked entire cases for him. His colleagues sometimes joked that he had a sixth sense, or that he was part bloodhound, but Miller just chalked it up to paying attention. People tell on themselves, he'd often say, you just have to listen close enough. His reputation preceded him. The rookies whispered stories of his past triumphs, the case of the missing antique clock solved by noticing a single, unusually clean patch of dust on the floor, or the art forgery ring busted because Miller recognized a specific type of rare brushstroke. It was this reputation that landed him the call about the peculiar death at the Barrington Apartments. The dispatcher's voice had been clipped and professional, but Miller had detected a hint of unease. Victim is female, early 20s. Apparent homicide. Forensics is on scene, but they requested you specifically, Detective Miller. Said there's something odd. Odd how? Miller had asked, already grabbing his coat. They wouldn't elaborate, sir. Just said it's a sock thing. A sock thing? Miller frowned. He'd seen a lot of strange things in his career, but a sock-related crime was a new one. He arrived at the Barrington Apartments to the flashing lights of police cruisers and the yellow tape cordoning off the entrance. The building itself was a relatively new construction, trying to pass itself off as luxury living, with its faux marble lobby and potted ferns. Inside apartment 3B, the scene was sterile, almost antiseptic. The victim, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, lay on the living room floor. Forensics technicians moved around her, meticulously collecting evidence. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the clinical odor of cleaning agents. Miller knelt beside the body, his eyes scanning the room. It was tidy, almost too tidy. A struggle had clearly taken place, an overturned coffee table, a shattered vase, but someone had attempted to clean it up, albeit hastily. That in itself was interesting. Most killers, in his experience, panicked and fled, leaving a chaotic mess in their wake. This suggested a degree of composure, a calculated effort to conceal the crime. Then he saw it. On Sarah Jenkins' feet were socks. But they weren't a matching pair. On her left foot was a large, thick athletic sock, the kind a man might wear for basketball. On her right foot was a smaller, thinner sock, clearly designed for a woman. The difference was jarring, almost comical in its absurdity. Miller felt a spark of intuition ignite within him. It wasn't just odd, it was a clue. A vital piece of the puzzle. He knew, with a certainty that bordered on premonition, that these mismatched socks held the key to unlocking this case. This wasn't just a sock thing, this was the whole thing. The apartment, 3B, felt wrong. Not just because of the obvious, the lifeless body, the somber faces of the forensics team, but because of the unnatural stillness. The air hung heavy, pregnant with unspoken dread. The attempt to clean up the scene was evident, but clumsy. Someone had wiped down the coffee table, leaving streaks on its polished surface. The shards of the broken vase had been swept into a corner, but tiny slivers of glass still glittered on the carpet like fallen stars. Miller circled the room slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. The victim, Sarah Jenkins, was petite, with delicate features frozen in a mask of surprise. Her dark hair was splayed across the floor like a spilled inkwell. The mismatched socks were even more striking up close. The large athletic sock was gray and bore the faint logo of a sporting goods company. The smaller sock was a pastel pink, with a delicate lace trim around the ankle. They were completely incongruous, a visual discord that screamed of something amiss. He knelt down again, examining the victim's hands. They were clean, no signs of defensive wounds. This suggested the attack had been swift, unexpected. He gently lifted her eyelids, noting the pinpoint pupils. Classic signs of asphyxiation. Cause of death, he asked one of the forensics technicians, a young woman with bright pink hair pulled back into a tight bun. Looks like strangulation, detective, she replied, without looking up from her work. Ligature marks on the neck, consistent with a thin cord or wire. Miller nodded, his gaze sweeping back to the room. A thin cord. Where was it? He scanned the floor, the furniture, but found nothing. The killer had been thorough, or so he thought. His eyes landed on a small, intricately carved wooden box on a nearby shelf. It was slightly ajar, the lid askew. He carefully opened it, revealing a collection of jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, earrings. Nothing seemed out of place, but then he noticed something. A small indentation in the velvet lining, as if something had been recently removed. Anything missing? He asked, turning to another technician who was dusting the shelves for fingerprints. The technician shrugged. We're still cataloging the items, detective. It'll take a while to determine if anything's missing. Miller made a mental note to follow up on the jewelry box. It felt significant. The missing item, whatever it was, could be the murder weapon, or it could be a valuable clue to the killer's identity. He returned his attention to the mismatched socks. Why? Why would the killer take the time to change the victim's socks? It made no sense. Unless. A thought flickered in his mind, a possibility so audacious, so unexpected, that it almost made him laugh. He stood up, his eyes gleaming with sudden understanding. He didn't change her socks, he murmured, almost to himself. He changed his. The killer hadn't been trying to disguise the victim. He'd been trying to disguise himself. He'd changed clothes with the victim to escape unnoticed, and in his haste, he'd grabbed the wrong pair of socks. A man wearing a dead woman's clothes. It was a crazy theory, but it was the only explanation that made sense. And Miles Miller, with his uncanny ability to see the things others missed, knew he was on the right track. The mismatched socks weren't just odd, they were a confession. Get me everything we have on the building's residents, Miller instructed his partner, Detective Riley, a young, eager officer who still hadn't quite gotten used to Miller's unconventional methods. And I want to talk to the neighbors. See if anyone saw anything at all out of the ordinary. Riley, ever the efficient one, was already on his phone, barking orders to the precinct. Right away, detective. I'll start with the super. He usually knows everything that's going on in a building like this. While Riley handled the logistics, Miller began his own round of interviews, starting with the apartments closest to 3B. The first few neighbors offered little of value. An elderly woman on the second floor claimed to have heard nothing. A young couple across the hall said they'd been out all evening. Standard responses, the kind Miller had heard 1,000 times before. People rarely wanted to get involved, even when a murder had happened right next door. Then he spoke to Mrs. Henderson, an older woman who lived in the apartment directly above Sarah Jenkins. Mrs. Henderson was initially hesitant, peering at Miller through a crack in her doorway with suspicion in her eyes. I don't know anything, detective, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I mostly keep to myself. I understand, Mrs. Henderson, Miller replied gently. But anything you can tell me, no matter how small it may seem, could be helpful. Did you hear anything unusual last night? See anyone coming or going? Mrs. Henderson hesitated for a moment, then sighed. Well, she said, I did hear something. Around, I'd say about 8 o'clock last night. It sounded like a scuffle, some furniture moving around. I thought it was just Sarah, moving things around in her apartment. She was always rearranging things, that girl. Did you hear any voices? Miller pressed. No, just the noise. Then it stopped. I didn't think anything of it, to be honest. Did you see anyone leaving the building last night, Mrs. Henderson? Well, now that you mention it, Mrs. Henderson said, her brow furrowing in thought, I did see someone leaving. A young woman, I think. She was wearing Sarah's clothes. I remember thinking it was odd, because Sarah usually wears such bright colors, and this woman was wearing something much more subdued. Miller's pulse quickened. Subdued how, Mrs. Henderson? Well, Sarah always wears those bright dresses, you know, with the flowers and the polka dots. This woman was wearing a plain gray sweater and jeans. And she had a baseball cap on, pulled down low, like she didn't want anyone to see her face. She was walking very fast, almost running. I just figured she was in a hurry. A woman in Sarah's clothes, hurrying away from the building. It fit perfectly with Miller's theory. The killer, disguised in the victim's clothing, trying to blend in, to escape unnoticed. Did you get a good look at her face, Mrs. Henderson? Miller asked, holding his breath. Mrs. Henderson shook her head sadly. No, detective. She had the cap pulled down so low, I couldn't see her face at all. Just her hair. It was dark, like Sarah's. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Mrs. Henderson's testimony confirmed Miller's suspicions. He had a killer who was not only cunning but also desperate. And desperation, Miller knew, often led to mistakes. He just had to be patient, to keep digging, to find the mistake that would crack the case wide open. That sock thing was only the beginning. Back in the dimly lit apartment, Miller stood beside Riley, who was hunched over a laptop, scrolling through building schematics. Super says there are security cameras in the lobby and by the back entrance, Riley reported, his fingers flying across the keyboard. I'm trying to access the footage from last night now. Miller nodded, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. Mrs. Henderson saw someone leaving in Sarah's clothes around 8 o'clock. Let's see if the cameras confirm it. A few minutes later, Riley had pulled up the security footage. The grainy black and white images showed the lobby of the Barrington apartments. Miller watched intently as people came and went, their faces blurred and indistinct. Then, at precisely 8:07 p.m., a figure emerged from the elevator. The figure was wearing a gray sweater, jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over their face, just as Mrs. Henderson had described. The person walked quickly, almost nervously, towards the front entrance, their head down, avoiding eye contact with the camera. There, Miller said, pointing at the screen. That's our person. Riley zoomed in on the figure, enhancing the image as much as possible. While the face remained obscured, Miller noticed something else. The way the person walked. There was a slight swagger, a subtle shift in the hips that seemed masculine. Notice anything, Riley? Miller asked, his eyes narrowed. Riley studied the footage for a moment. Yeah, now that you mention it, the hips seem a bit wide for a woman. And the shoulders are kind of broad. Exactly, Miller said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. Our killer is likely a man. A man disguised in Sarah Jenkins' clothes. He paused the footage, focusing on the person's feet. The image was blurry, but Miller could just make out the outline of the shoes. They appeared to be sneakers, and they seemed large. Check the size of Sarah's shoes, Miller instructed Riley. See if they matched the size of the shoes in the footage. Riley quickly accessed Sarah Jenkins' file and pulled up a list of her personal belongings. Her shoe size is a women's size 7, he reported. Those shoes in the footage look much bigger. They are, Miller said, his voice filled with certainty. Because they're not her shoes. They're his. The security footage, combined with Mrs. Henderson's testimony and the mismatched socks, was building a compelling case. The killer had changed clothes with the victim, put on a baseball cap to hide his face, and tried to escape undetected. But he had made mistakes. He had grabbed the wrong socks, walked with a masculine swagger, and worn shoes that were too big. Okay, Riley, Miller said, turning to his partner. Time to dig deeper. I want a list of all the men who knew Sarah Jenkins. Ex-boyfriends, business partners, anyone who had a reason to be in her apartment last night. And I want their shoe sizes. Let's see who wears a size 11 sneaker and has a motive for murder. The chase was on. The killer thought he was clever, but Miller was smarter. And he was closing in. That sock thing had led him to the truth, and he wasn't about to let it go. Riley leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. The precinct was a hive of activity, phones ringing, officers shouting, the constant hum of computers filling the air. But Miller, oblivious to the chaos around him, was pacing back and forth in front of the whiteboard, covered in photos, timelines, and scribbled notes. "Okay, let's walk through this again," Miller said, stopping in front of Riley. "Tell me what you think happened, from start to finish." Riley sighed, but he knew better than to argue with Miller when he was in one of his thinking moods. "All right," he said, "the victim, Sarah Jenkins, was strangled in her apartment sometime between 7 and 8 p.m. last night. The killer attempted to clean up the scene, but missed some details. He then changed clothes with the victim to escape unnoticed." "Why would he do that, Riley?" Miller pressed. "To avoid suspicion," Riley replied. "If he just walked out of the building covered in blood, he'd be immediately identified as the prime suspect. But if he's dressed in the victim's clothes, he might be able to blend in, to look like just another resident." "Exactly," Miller said, snapping his fingers. "He's counting on people seeing him as Sarah, not as a killer. It's a bold move, but it's also incredibly risky. Because it leaves him vulnerable. He has to act like Sarah, to walk like Sarah, to be Sarah, for at least a few minutes. And that's where he makes his mistakes." "The socks?" Riley asked, pointing to a photo of the mismatched socks pinned to the whiteboard. "The socks are the key, Riley," Miller said, his voice filled with conviction. "They're the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that ties everything together. Think about it. The killer is in a hurry, he's panicked, he needs to get out of that apartment as quickly as possible. He grabs Sarah's clothes, throws them on, but he doesn't have time to think about the details. He grabs the first pair of socks he can find, not realizing that they don't match." "And the size difference?" Riley asked. "The size difference is crucial," Miller said. "It tells us that the killer is likely a man. A man with larger feet than Sarah Jenkins. He can squeeze his feet into her shoes, but he can't squeeze them into her socks. So he ends up wearing one of her socks and one of his own." Miller paused, letting his theory sink in. "It's all about the details, Riley. The small, seemingly insignificant details that other people miss. The mismatched socks, the masculine swagger, the oversized shoes. These are the things that will lead us to the killer." Riley nodded, finally understanding the brilliance of Miller's deduction. "So, what's next, detective?" "Next," Miller said, a gleam in his eye, "we narrow down our list of suspects. We find the man who wears a size 11 sneaker, who knew Sarah Jenkins, and who has a motive for murder. And then we bring him in. And we ask him about the socks." That sock thing was no longer just a theory, it was a weapon. And Miller was ready to use it. The CCTV footage played again and again on the screen, a silent loop of a desperate escape. The figure in Sarah's clothes hurried through the lobby, their face hidden beneath the baseball cap. Each time Miller watched it, he saw something new, some subtle detail that he had missed before. The way the person's hand clenched into a fist as they passed the security guard, the slight limp in their left leg, the way they kept glancing nervously over their shoulder. "Run it again," Miller said, his eyes glued to the screen. "Focus on the hands." Riley zoomed in on the figure's hands, which were partially visible beneath the sleeves of the gray sweater. Miller noticed that the fingernails were short and ragged, like someone who worked with their hands. "He's not used to wearing women's clothes," Miller murmured. "He's uncomfortable, he's self-conscious. He probably feels like he's wearing a costume." He paused the footage, focusing on the figure's shoes. The oversized sneakers were clearly visible now, their laces untied. "Untied laces," Miller said, shaking his head. Another mistake. He was in such a hurry, he didn't even bother to tie his shoes. He was just focused on getting out of there. The security footage was a goldmine of information, a visual record of the killer's desperation and carelessness. But it wasn't enough. They needed more. They needed a name, a face, a connection to Sarah Jenkins. What do we have on Sarah's relationships? Miller asked Riley. Ex-boyfriends, business partners, anyone who might have had a reason to want her dead. Riley pulled up Sarah Jenkins' file on his computer. She had a few ex-boyfriends, nothing serious. A couple of short-term relationships that ended amicably. No restraining orders, no history of violence. What about business partners? Miller pressed. She owned a small boutique downtown, Riley reported. Sold vintage clothing and accessories. She had one business partner, a man named David Carter. David Carter, Miller repeated, writing the name on the whiteboard. What do we know about him? He's been her business partner for about 2 years, Riley said. They seem to have a good working relationship. No history of disputes or disagreements. Dig deeper, Riley, Miller instructed. I want to know everything about David Carter. His background, his finances, his relationships. I want to know what he was doing last night. And I want his shoe size. Miller knew that David Carter might be a dead end. But he couldn't afford to overlook any possibilities. The killer was out there, somewhere, and he was counting on them to give up, to lose interest, to move on to another case. But Miller wasn't about to let that happen. He was determined to catch this killer, to bring him to justice, to give Sarah Jenkins the peace she deserved. The CCTV footage had given them a glimpse of the killer's desperation, but it was the deeper dive into Sarah's life that would reveal his identity. The sock thing had started the investigation, but it was the relentless pursuit of the truth that would bring it to an end. Riley returned a few hours later, his arms laden with files. Okay, detective, he said, dropping the files onto the table with a thud, I've got everything you wanted on Sarah Jenkins' relationships. Starting with the ex-boyfriends. He opened one of the files and began to read. First up, Mark Thompson. Dated Sarah for about 6 months, ended about a year ago. Seems like a clean break. No history of violence, no restraining orders. He's got an alibi for last night, he was at a conference in Chicago. Cross him off the list, Miller said, already moving on. Next, we have Kevin Peterson. Dated Sarah for about 3 months, ended about 6 months ago. This one's a little more interesting. According to her friends, he was pretty jealous and possessive. He didn't take the breakup well. Jealous and possessive, Miller repeated, his interest piqued. Anything else? Yeah, Riley said, flipping through the file. Apparently, they had a pretty big argument a few weeks ago. He accused her of seeing someone else. Things got heated, according to one of her friends who witnessed the argument. Did he threaten her? Miller asked. Not explicitly, Riley said. But he was definitely angry. He said some things that made her uncomfortable. Get me everything we have on Kevin Peterson, Miller instructed. His address, his phone number, his alibi for last night. And I want to know his shoe size. Riley nodded, already typing the information into his computer. What about the business partner, David Carter? I'm still digging into him, Riley said. He seems like a pretty straight-laced guy. No criminal record, no history of violence. But I did find something interesting. Apparently, their business hasn't been doing so well lately. The boutique is struggling to stay afloat. Financial trouble, Miller said, his eyes narrowing. That could be a motive. Maybe they had a falling out over money. Maybe he thought he could get more money if Sarah was out of the picture. It's possible, Riley said. But I haven't found any evidence of that yet. He seems genuinely distraught about Sarah's death. He's been cooperating fully with the police. Cooperation doesn't equal innocence, Miller said, his voice hard. "I want to talk to David Carter. I want to see how he reacts when I ask him about Sarah's death. And I want to see his shoes." As Riley continued to gather information on Kevin Peterson and David Carter, Miller couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. The killer was still out there, and he was getting further away with each passing hour. He had to act fast, to follow every lead, to leave no stone unturned. The sock thing had given them a head start, but it was the relentless pursuit of the truth that would ultimately bring the killer to justice. The deeper they dug into Sarah's life, the closer they would get to the man who had taken it. The recent argument with a jealous ex-boyfriend and the strained business relationship were now the primary focus. The search warrant for Kevin Peterson's apartment came through quickly. The judge, after hearing about the recent argument and the lack of a solid alibi, had been convinced. Miller, accompanied by Riley and a team of officers, arrived at Peterson's address, a small, run-down apartment in a less-than-desirable part of town. Peterson answered the door looking disheveled and surprised. He was a tall, lanky man with a nervous energy about him. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding direct contact. "Mr. Peterson," Miller said, holding up the search warrant, "we have a warrant to search your apartment in connection with the murder of Sarah Jenkins." Peterson's face paled. "I didn't kill Sarah," he stammered. "I loved her." "We'll see about that," Miller said, stepping inside. The apartment was a mess, clothes strewn across the floor, dirty dishes piled in the sink. It was clear that Peterson wasn't much of a housekeeper. The officers began their search, meticulously combing through the apartment, looking for any sign of Sarah Jenkins or any evidence that might connect Peterson to the murder. Miller watched Peterson closely, observing his every move. He noticed that Peterson was sweating profusely, despite the cool temperature in the apartment. He kept fidgeting with his hands, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. He was clearly nervous, but was it the nervousness of an innocent man being wrongly accused, or the nervousness of a guilty man trying to hide something? The search yielded nothing of immediate value. No blood, no murder weapon, no sign of Sarah Jenkins' belongings. The officers found a pair of size 11 sneakers in Peterson's closet, which fit the description of the shoes seen in the CCTV footage, but that was hardly conclusive evidence. "Where were you last night, Mr. Peterson?" Miller asked, his voice calm but firm. Peterson hesitated for a moment, then said, "I was at home. Watching TV. Can anyone confirm that?" Miller pressed. Peterson shook his head. "No. I was alone." "So you have no alibi for last night?" Miller asked. "No," Peterson admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Miller studied Peterson's face, looking for any sign of deception. He noticed that Peterson's eyes kept darting towards a closed closet in the corner of the room. "What's in the closet, Mr. Peterson?" Miller asked, pointing to the closet. Peterson's face flushed. "Just clothes," he said quickly. "Nothing important." Miller walked over to the closet and opened it. Inside, he found a jumble of clothes, mostly men's clothing. But then he saw something that caught his eye. Tucked away in the back of the closet, hidden beneath a pile of sweaters, was a gray baseball cap. The same type of baseball cap that the figure in the CCTV footage had been wearing. It wasn't direct evidence, but it was enough to raise Miller's suspicions even further. While no concrete evidence was discovered, the baseball cap and Peterson's nervous demeanor solidified him as a strong suspect. It was a subtle clue, but Miller knew that even the smallest details could be significant. That sock thing had taught him that. As the search of Peterson's apartment wrapped up, Miller felt a nagging sense of incompleteness. He had a strong suspect, a motive, and circumstantial evidence, but he lacked the concrete proof he needed to make an arrest. He needed something more, something that would definitively link Peterson to the crime. He stood in the doorway, watching as Peterson was being questioned by Riley. Peterson continued to deny any involvement in Sarah's death, but his voice was trembling, and his eyes were filled with fear. Then, something clicked in Miller's mind. He remembered something from the crime scene, something that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now took on a new importance. He remembered the size of Sarah Jenkins' clothing. He turned to Riley and said, "What size clothes did Sarah wear?" Riley consulted his notes. "She was a size 2, he replied. "Small frame." Miller looked back at Peterson, who was wearing a pair of jeans that seemed a bit too tight for him. He was a tall, lanky man, but the jeans were clinging to his legs in a way that looked uncomfortable. "Those pants," Miller said, pointing at Peterson's jeans. "They look a little snug, don't they?" Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "They're just jeans," he said. "What's the big deal? What size are they?" Miller pressed. Peterson hesitated, then said, "I don't know. I think they're a 32. "A 32? Miller repeated, his eyes narrowing. "And you're telling me that a man your size can comfortably fit into a pair of size 32 jeans that used to belong to a woman who wore a size 2? Peterson's face flushed. "I didn't say they were comfortable," he mumbled. "I just said they're jeans." Miller walked over to Peterson and examined his pants more closely. He noticed that the fabric was stretched tight across his thighs and that the waistband was digging into his skin. He also noticed something else. A faint stain on the waistband, near the back. It was barely visible, but it was there. "I want those pants taken as evidence," Miller said, his voice firm. "I think we'll find something interesting on them." Riley looked surprised, but he didn't question Miller's instincts. He knew that Miller had a knack for noticing the things that other people missed. He quickly retrieved an evidence bag and instructed Peterson to remove his pants. Peterson protested, but he knew that he had no choice. He reluctantly took off his pants and handed them over to Riley. As he did so, Miller noticed that Peterson's hands were trembling even more than before. "We're done here, Mr. Peterson," Miller said. "You're free to go. But don't leave town. We'll be in touch." As Peterson left the apartment, Miller felt a surge of excitement. He knew that he was close to cracking the case. The sock thing had led him to the security footage had led him to Kevin Peterson, and now, Kevin Peterson's too tight pants were about to lead him to the truth. He hoped that the faint stain would be enough. He needed that break. He needed the pants to scream the truth. The next 24 hours were agonizing. Miller paced his office, replaying the events of the past few days in his mind, searching for any detail he might have missed. He knew that the case hinged on the results of the DNA analysis on Peterson's pants. If the stain on the waistband contained Sarah Jenkins' DNA, it would be game over for Peterson. But if it didn't, they would have to release him, and the killer would walk free. Finally, the call came. It was Riley, his voice tight with excitement. "Detective," he said, "I just got the results back from the lab. The DNA on the waistband of Peterson's pants, it's a match. It's Sarah Jenkins' DNA." Miller felt a surge of relief wash over him. He had done it. That sock thing had led him to the killer, and the DNA evidence had sealed the deal. Where on the waistband was the DNA found? Miller asked, his voice calm but firm. "On the inside," Riley replied. "Specifically, on the inside back of the waistband, where it would have been in direct contact with skin." Miller nodded, a grim satisfaction in his voice. That was the key. If the DNA had been on the outside of the pants, it could have been explained away. But the fact that it was on the inside, where it would have come into contact with Peterson's skin, proved that he had been wearing Sarah Jenkins' clothing. "Bring him in, Riley," Miller said. "I want him in custody, and I want him questioned. And I want to be there when he hears the news." A few hours later, Kevin Peterson was sitting in an interrogation room at the precinct, his face pale and drawn. He was still denying any involvement in Sarah's death, but his voice lacked conviction. Miller entered the room, carrying the lab report in his hand. He sat down across from Peterson and looked him in the eye. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice low and steady, we sent your pants to the lab for DNA analysis. And the results came back. We found Sarah Jenkins' DNA on the waistband of your pants. Specifically, on the inside of the waistband, where it would have been in direct contact with your skin. Peterson's face crumbled. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He just stared at Miller, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. We know you killed Sarah Jenkins, Mr. Peterson, Miller continued. We know you changed clothes with her to escape unnoticed. And we know that you wore her pants. The DNA doesn't lie. It's time to tell us the truth. The DNA evidence was the final piece of the puzzle. The sock thing had started the investigation, but the DNA had brought it to a close. It was time for Kevin Peterson to face the consequences of his actions. The silence in the interrogation room was thick and heavy, broken only by Peterson's ragged breathing. He stared at the lab report, his eyes darting back and forth, as if searching for a loophole, a way out. But there was none. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Okay, he said, okay, I did it. Miller leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Peterson's face. Tell me what happened, Mr. Peterson. Tell me the truth. Peterson began to talk, his words tumbling out in a rush. He described how he had gone to Sarah's apartment that night, hoping to reconcile with her. They had argued, as they had done so many times before. He accused her of seeing someone else, of not loving him anymore. She denied it, but he didn't believe her. He lost his temper, he said. He didn't mean to hurt her, but he couldn't control himself. He grabbed her, he pushed her, and then, he couldn't remember exactly what happened. All he remembered was her lying on the floor, not moving. I didn't mean to kill her, he sobbed. It was an accident. I swear. Miller didn't say anything. He just listened, letting Peterson tell his story. I panicked, Peterson continued. I didn't know what to do. I knew that if I called the police, they would think I did it on purpose. So I tried to clean up the apartment. I didn't want anyone to know I was there. And then you changed clothes with her? Miller asked, his voice calm but firm. Peterson nodded. Yes, he said. I knew that if I just walked out of the building, someone would see me, and they would know I was there. So I changed clothes with her. I thought that if I looked like her, no one would suspect anything. And the socks? Miller asked, his eyes narrowing. Peterson hesitated for a moment, then said, I didn't have time to find a matching pair. I just grabbed the first socks I could find. And the baseball cap? Miller pressed. I didn't want anyone to see my face, Peterson said. I thought if I wore a cap, they wouldn't recognize me. Miller leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He had heard it all before. The denials, the excuses, the attempts to minimize their guilt. But he knew that Peterson was telling the truth, or at least, his version of the truth. You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Jenkins, Mr. Peterson, Miller said, his voice hard. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As Riley led Peterson out of the interrogation room, Miller felt a sense of exhaustion wash over him. The case was closed, the killer had been caught, but it was a hollow victory. Sarah Jenkins was still dead, and nothing could bring her back. Peterson confessed, admitting to changing clothes but claiming the murder was accidental, a claim Miller knew the courts would have to decide. The sock thing had been the key, but it was the DNA evidence that had finally broken Peterson. Back in his office, Miller sat alone, staring out the window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The rain had started again, a steady drumming against the glass, mirroring the persistent ache in his heart. He thought about Sarah Jenkins, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, cut short by a moment of senseless violence. He thought about Kevin Peterson, a jealous and possessive man who had let his anger get the better of him. And he thought about the mismatched socks, the seemingly insignificant detail that had started it all. Riley entered the office, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Miller and sat down in the chair opposite him. "Tough case, Detective," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "They're all tough, Riley," Miller replied, his voice weary. "But this one was different. It was all about the details. The small, seemingly insignificant details that other people missed." "Like the socks," Riley said, smiling slightly. "Exactly," Miller said. "The socks, the baseball cap, the oversized shoes, the too tight pants. These were the things that led us to Peterson. These were the things that proved he was lying." "You have a good eye, Detective," Riley said. "You notice things that other people don't." "It's not just about having a good eye, Riley," Miller said. "It's about paying attention. It's about listening to what people are saying, and more importantly, to what they're not saying. It's about seeing the connections, the patterns, the things that don't quite fit." He paused, taking a long sip of his coffee. "And it's about the power of forensic science," he added. "Without the DNA evidence, we would have had a hard time proving Peterson's guilt. The circumstantial evidence was strong, but it wasn't enough. The DNA was the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that sealed the deal." Miller looked out the window again, his gaze fixed on the city lights. "This case reminded me that even the smallest details can be the most important. That a tiny thread, seemingly insignificant, can unravel an entire crime." "So, what's next, Detective?" Riley asked. Miller shrugged. "Another case, another crime, another set of details to unravel," he said. "The city never sleeps, Riley. And neither do we." He finished his coffee and stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. "Come on," he said. "Let's get out of here. I need some sleep." As they walked out of the office, Miller couldn't help but think about that sock thing. It was a strange, almost comical detail, but it had been the key to unlocking the mystery of Sarah Jenkins' death. It was a reminder that in the world of crime, nothing was too small to be important. The smallest details, combined with keen observation and the power of forensic science, could bring even the most cunning killer to justice. The case was closed, but the lesson remained: pay attention to the socks. And everything else.